Welcome to Happy Stories. We're going to be reading a story, but first we are going to be reading the Bible, and then we are going to be doing the synopsis, and then we are going to be reading the Hittite Warrior. If you guys don't, make sure to like button, subscribe, and button on the video. It's not the Hittite Warrior, it's Hittite Warrior. So if you enjoy, make sure to like button, subscribe, and button. I already said that. So it's time for the Hittite to read the Bible.
I am not a Hittite.
Yes, but this one is.
Baby Yoda's not a Hittite either.
It's a Baby Yoda.
Baby Yoda is not a Hittite.
Baby Yoda's not a Grogu either.
But Baby Yoda is the child. All right, come on, let's go. Hello, how are we today? Oh, it's going to be one of those days, is it? Ha ha ha. All right, so, yeah, I can already tell. Okay. Wow, that's not distracting at all. Let's see. I can't ever tell this until it's time, but it just whitewashed me. All right, we're on Ecclesiastes chapter 4. Oh, maybe if I stay right here, maybe it'll be better. All right, Ecclesiastes chapter 4. This is the English Standard Version of the Bible. Let me begin. Again I saw all the oppressions that are done under the sun, and behold, the tears of the oppressed, and they had no one to comfort them. On the side of their oppressors there was power, and there was no one to comfort them. And I thought the dead who are already dead more fortunate than the living who are still alive. But better than both is he who has not yet been and has not seen the evil deeds that are done under the sun. Let me read that verse again. But better than both is he who has not yet been and has not seen the evil deeds that are done under the sun. Then I saw that all toil and all skill in work come from a man's envy of his neighbor. This also is vanity and a striving after wind. The fool folds his hands and eats his own flesh. Better is a handful of quietness than 2 hands full of toil and a striving after wind. Again I saw vanity under the sun, one person who has no other, either son or brother, yet there is no end to all his toil, and his eyes are never satisfied with riches, so that he never asks, for whom am I toiling and depriving myself of pleasure? This also is vanity and an unhappy business. 2 are better than 1, because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him who is alone when he falls, and has not another to lift him up. Again, if 2 lie together, they keep warm, but how can one keep warm alone? And though a man might prevail against one who is alone, 2 will withstand him. A 3-fold cord is not quickly broken. Better was a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who no longer knew how to take advice. For he went from prison to the throne, though in his own kingdom he had been born poor. I saw all the living who move about under the sun, along with that youth who was to stand in the king's place. There was no end of all the people, all of whom he led. Yet those who come later will not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity and a striving after wind. That is the end of Ecclesiastes chapter 4. And again, I'm sorry about the whitewashing. I will have to figure that out eventually. So probably in 3 years we'll finally have a live stream that is easy to watch. All right, so we in the last chapter, let's see, there was the lady, what was her name? Maris, and she told a story about a princess and a Hittite prince, and the story, in the story, the prince died, and then all of a sudden the story magically became alive and everybody in the family died. And now here's Kimberly to say how it really happened.
You know, with Little Women, Dad couldn't kill people very often. And when people actually died, he said that they didn't die. So what actually happened was, I'm sorry I forgot her name, but the grandma told stories, told stories to kind of pass the time and everything. And eventually they found out that it's Yavin?
Yep.
Yavin.
He was...
I remember that because of Star Wars.
Yes, I know. So Yavin was going to be sacrificed to the god. And so, guess who comes to the rescue? Yes, Dad, please help me. Jotham. I'm sorry, I'm relearning names. Just after I got everybody's name in Little Women. So, Jotham goes over and saves Yavin, and thanks to, I'm sorry I'm forgetting names, Uriah. I still want to call him Iori from Dad's book. Uriah, helped, he kind of was like, oh hey, there are guards here. And the guards are like, help us look for this guy. He committed a great crime. And he didn't even get a description. So he walks over there and he sees them and he's like, oh, I get it now. That was mine. And he didn't say anything. There's nothing here, he said. And they're like, okay, let's go look somewhere else. Yay. I'm going to hand it off to Dad, who's going to read us a story.
Hello again! And that reminded me that I need to turn off my notifications. Yay! Alright, so we're on chapter 8, the Boat, also known as Boat.
The Boat?
By the way, Yavin is not Yavin like in Star Wars. It's Yabin, and the first letter is actually a J. I'm pronouncing it like a Y. I'm pronouncing it like a Y because that's the way most countries pronounce their J's. It's just English that's weird. All right, so we're on chapter 8, the Boat, or also known as the Boat. Let me begin. Jotham took his arm from around my neck, but kept tight hold of his knife. He was trembling with fear, and his eyes were bright and fierce. "Do as I tell you," he said to me, "and you too," pushing with his foot at the frightened child. And to him he added, "Take off that robe." "But it's cold still," whimpered the little boy, his voice shaking. Jotham cuffed him, and the child began to cry. "Do as I say, or I will let them have you back. You," he said to me, "bring me some of that dark stuff over there. Don't try to run, or I will throw this knife though you have been my friend." I saw that it was wiser not to argue with him. Not wanting his knife in my throat, I obeyed, stumbling about in the dark, for the sun had not yet begun to rise. I brought the bolt of woolen stuff to Jotham, who, with his knife, slashed off enough to wrap the child and cover his purple-bordered tunic. "Now, go ahead of me," he said, "and if you cry, Yavin, I will throw you into the water and drown you." "Where will you go?" I asked him. "To the mainland by boat," said Jotham. "You too." With a sinking heart, for I was afraid of boats, I moved ahead of him to the door of the warehouse. There was no one about on the quay, so we went outside. "Don't try to run," said Jotham again, flashing his knife in my eyes. We made our way in silence down to Ethbaal's wharf, Jotham dragging Yavin roughly along behind him. There was a small boat there with oars, and Jotham's command, the little Canaanite boy jumped in like a cat. "Now you," Jotham said to me. I felt sick looking at the frail thing swaying from side to side beneath me, but I closed my eyes, prayed softly to Teshub of the double axe, and jumped. My feet hit the shallow bottom of the boat, and the world seemed to rock crazily about me. I almost went into the water, which would surely have been the end of me, but instead I fell to my knees and crouched in the bow, clinging to the sides and shaking with terror, while Jotham jumped and the rocking began again. "Take an oar," he said, and my knees still trembling, I started to obey him. Then something happened. Another group of soldiers, Egyptians this time, had come onto the waterfront. Jotham was turned away from them and did not see them. They were coming toward Ethbaal's wharf, and in another moment, if we stayed as we were, would be able to see us, for the sun was beginning to rise. This was my chance. I did not even have to cry out and risk Jotham's knife. I had only to stay silent, and I would be safe, and the wrath of Moloch would be averted from the city. I will never know why, but I heard myself saying softly, "Jotham, get down! There are soldiers on the quay." Jotham fell flat on the bottom of the boat and pulled Jabin down with him, his hand over his mouth. I crouched too, as low as I could, and we lay still, the boat moving quietly with the water. We listened to the sound of the men's feet as they came closer, and soon heard their voices above us. Jabin did not even whimper, and I tried not to breathe. Jotham's chest did not move, so I supposed that he too was holding his breath. Finally, they passed on. We lay silent till there was no sound but the lapping of the sea against the wharf. Then Jotham raised his head and let out his breath in a long sigh. "It's all right," he said at last. "No one is here." In silence, we took our places in the boat. I had never held an oar before, but found that it fitted easily enough in my hand. Before I realized what was happening, we were clear of the wharf. Our progress was uneven at first, but I did as well as I could. Jotham was looking at me curiously, and I knew he was wondering why I had warned him. I was wondering myself. To steal the sacrifice of a god was an offense I had never even dreamt of committing or helping to commit, and I was unsure that disaster I was sure that disaster would now follow me for the rest of my life. As for Jotham, "Where will you go now?" I asked him. "You can never go back to Tyre." "I know that," said Jotham. "When we are far enough south from the city, I will leave the boat and sink it. Then I will go inland, into the hills, where we will be as safe as anyone can be in this country." "What's in the hills?" I asked him. "Sheep and wolves," said Jotham. "Some towns and vineyards, rough land. Some things that are dangerous, like slave raiders and Canaanite troops. But you can dodge them if you try. Now, what are you crying about?" For the tears were running down Jabin's face, and he was sniffing and coughing. "I don't want to go into the hills," he sobbed. "I want my own house. I want my mother." Jotham stared at him in disgust. "Look at him," he said. "Why is he worth it?" He stopped, looking pale and grim. I knew he was realizing, perhaps for the first time, just what he had done for the sake of this frightened, fretful little boy. For he was outside the law now, an outcast among the Canaanites as well as his own people. There would be no more books to read or peaceful rest in his great bed in the house of Ethbaal, and no more hours of happiness in the quiet apartment of the Lady Maris, and he would never see Mehetabel again. It occurred to me that I, too, might find myself under a cloud when I got back, and I looked at Jabin and grimly as Jotham did, but the child seemed to be tired from crying and sat pale and silent in the bottom of the boat. I took off my outer garment and waded it into something like a pillow. "Here," I said grudgingly, and shoved it back of him. He laid his head on it, and after a while slept. "How did you do it?" I asked Jotham at last. "And how did you dare?" "It was strange," said Jotham. "I never meant to do it. It just happened. I went out to walk in the streets, and I saw a procession with this one," gesturing toward Jabin, "in the middle of it. The eunuch priests of Astarte were taking him to the temple to be prepared, but they were so taken up with wailing and beating their breasts for the death of Adonai that they were not even watching. He was so frightened he could hardly walk, and when he saw me, he called my name. I didn't even think. I just beckoned to him, and he slipped away from them as easily as that. I had him down in the warehouse before they even knew he was gone. The sun was high when Jotham finally pulled ashore. The heights of Tyre could still be seen, but we could surely not be seen from them. Jotham drew the boat up onto the stony beach, then shook Jabin by the shoulder. "Wake up," he said, more kindly than he had spoken to him before. "We're here." Jabin sat up, blinking fearfully. Jotham pulled him out of the boat. Then he looked at me. "You will have to come with me," he said. "I must be sure of getting far away from Tyre before they know that I have left the city." I shrugged. I did not blame him for not trusting me. It was always better, I supposed, not to take chances. I looked around me. The sun was shining, and the air was fresh and clean. All was quiet and peaceful. I thought of the narrow alleys and high wall of Tyre, and the smell of the dye houses. I did not mind being Jotham's prisoner for a little while, but I was to be a prisoner for longer than I thought, and Jotham was not to be my captor. Chapter 9. The Hills. With sharp stones and heavy sticks, Jotham and I stove in the frail little boat. Then we shoved it out, filled it with stones, and watched it go down. Jotham had brought along some cakes, and from these we took a light breakfast. "Shouldn't he have milk?" I asked, pointing at Jabin. "Why?" asked Jotham, and I said I had heard that small children usually did, that sometimes they lived on milk. But Jotham said that I knew nothing about it, and that Jabin would have to eat what we did. When we had finished eating, he said that the sooner we got away from the shore, the better. We dared not follow the highway, but we knew that we wanted to go east, and both Jotham and I could tell directions well enough by sun and shadow, and at night by the stars. For a while the countryside was smooth enough, but later it became rough and steeper. It was not long before Jabin began to stumble, and Jotham, muttering to himself, had to carry him. After a while we took our turns with him. It was not the easiest way to travel. Later in the day I heard a sound that made my heart quicken. It was the sound of a horse's hoofs and the rattle of chariot wheels. Jotham caught my arm and pulled me down behind a large rock. "What is it?" I asked him. "You will see," he replied, and I watched as well as I could from behind the rock. A group of armed men came into view wearing the feathered helmets of the Canaanites. The leader rode in a chariot, but the rest were on foot. Behind them walked or stumbled a line of tall, powerful men, barefooted or in rough boots, dressed in plain, straight, homespun tunics, and with untrimmed beards. As they passed by, I saw that they were bound together with a heavy rope passed from one to another about their necks. "Who are they?" I asked softly after they had gone by. "Hill people," said Jotham. "Shepherds, Hebrews, probably of the tribe of Naphtali." I stared after them in deep curiosity, remembering what Hannibal had told me of these people. "The soldiers have probably brought them from the slave raiders," said Jotham. "The temples will either use them or sell them to private men. They all seem strong in that gang, so they are probably meant for the grindstones in the dye houses." He drew a deep breath and gazed hungrily about the soft, sunlit countryside. "They had better use their eyes while they still have them. All things will be dark for them soon." He spoke calmly enough, but his face was pale. "Why do they let them do it?" I asked. "They have no leader, no judge," said Jotham. "We of the Hebrew tribes and great leaders once, had great leaders once. We of the Hebrew tribes had great leaders once, but we have been scattered by Egypt and the Hittites, and the Canaanites who bowed before their conquerors are rewarded and can put their heels upon us." "They should fight them," I grumbled to myself. "It is better to die fighting than to live as slaves." Then I stopped, ashamed, remembering how I had lived like a slave at home and had not died. But now Jotham was warning me to keep my eyes sharp and my wits about me. "There are things in the hills," he said, "that are worse than Canaanite troops. Men from the desert Moabites, Midianites, Amalekites. They come in from the east through the valley of Bashan and lie in wait for travelers and shepherds. They have grown great and prosperous through their trade in men and women. We have come upon a small stream at which we replenished our water skins, and lay still a while to rest. The soft smell of juniper and mulberry was in the air, and Jabin, who had never been far from the city, lay sniffing the air and asking questions. "There are lions out here in the country, aren't there?" he asked. "Yes," said Jotham. "Did you ever kill a lion?" "No," said Jotham. "I did," I told him, and I gave him the story of the time a beast had come down upon our range and attacked some colts. I had not exactly killed it myself, but had held it off with a club and a knife till help had come. Jabin stared at me in awe, and Jotham looked at me with some envy and told Jabin not to talk so much. We were not so easy in our minds as the little boy, for our food was nearly gone. "We must get more," said Jotham. "Yes," I agreed, "but how?" "These lands are grazing lands," he said. "There must be sheep herders about, not far away. The tribesmen are hospitable, and will take us in for the night at least." He fell silent. He was looking no farther ahead than this one night, and I trembled, wondering what the days ahead could hold in store. I looked uneasily about, and the country no longer seemed soft and sunlit. It was a rough, hard land here in the hills, where with fruitful dangers lying in wait, very different from the Canaan I had come to know in Tyre. It was a lonely land, too, and for the rest of the day we saw no signs of human life and heard no voices but our own. It was not till the shadows had fallen that Jabin pulled at my robe and said, "There is a man over there on that hill." We looked, and through the dim light made out a lonely figure on a ridge not far away. He carried a shepherd's staff, but had no sheep. Jotham hailed him. Jotham hailed him. "Stranger," he shouted through his cupped hands. "Hi-yi!" The man on the ridge heard him. He stood with one arm raised in greeting, waiting for us to come up to him, and he showed no fear as I would have done if I had been alone in these hills, hailed by two strange men. "Peace be with you," gasped Jotham, when we had struggled up to his side. "Are you a Naphthalite?" The stranger nodded, looking us over calmly. I saw there was no reason for him to be afraid of us, though we were two and he was only one. He was not tall, but was the most powerful-looking man I had ever seen. "I am Jotham ben Amram," said Jotham, "of the tribe of Ephraim in the south. These are my friends. Are you from these parts?" "From Kadesh on the Jordan," said the stranger. He had a quiet, mild voice. His face was ugly, but his eyes made that unimportant, for they were deep-set and earnest, and so wide open and direct that it was hard to look away from them. He did not tell us his name, but waited for Jotham to speak again. "My friend and I have been traveling all day," said Jotham, and could not manage to keep his voice from quivering a little. "The child is tired. Do you know of people here who would take us in for the night?" The stranger's eyes moved quickly over us, taking in our soft, finely woven clothing and our soft skins, for mine had softened too in the past year. Our earrings and ornaments were gone. We had sunk them with the boat, thinking they would only be a temptation to robbers, though we might have gotten a good price for them in some inland town. When his eyes came to Jabin, clinging to Jotham's hand and staring at him hopefully, his face softened and he smiled a little. "Follow me," he said. We obeyed. I kept my eyes upon him, taking in his shepherd's robe, which was of good material and dyed in several different colors. He walked easily, like a man who was used to rough country and long journeys on his own feet. But now we were again on smoother ground. Looking out across the valley, I could make out other figures some flocks and dogs who barked at the sight of us, and I knew that at least we had come to a dwelling place of the Hebrews. A small boy saw our guide and ran toward him with outstretched hands. A man followed more slowly. Both greeted him with such delight and respect that I knew him to be a man of renown in these parts, but they did not say his name, perhaps because we were there. Jabin, by this time, had fallen asleep in earnest and was bundled over Jotham's shoulder like a sack of grain. These people, our guide told us, were of the family of Hushai ben Aaron, a rich shepherd of the tribe of Naphtali. It was two of Hushai's sons, a young man and a boy, who had come to greet our guide. "Who are our guests?" asked the young man, whose name was Samuel. His words were polite enough, but there was no friendliness in his eyes. From the moment I saw him, I decided that I did not like him, and that he felt the same about me. "My friend is one of you," I said. "I am a Hittite, in exile from my country." "And the child?" asked our guide. He was again looking at the fine cloth of the boy's tunic, with its purple border and dainty handiwork. He is a Canaanite from Tyre," said Jotham. "We will ask no more questions," said the stranger at last. "Later, when you have rested and eaten, you will tell us more of these strange things." As they went before us, I heard him speak softly to Samuel and the boy. "Do not say my name before these strangers, and tell the same to your father and the others." On a level ground were the tents of Hushai ben Aaron. They were of black goat's hair, and betokened the wealth of their owner, with rich curtains inside to divide one section from another. In the great tent of Hushai himself, to which we were taken, there was only one ornament. It was the small statue of a golden bull, which I supposed was a household image of their god. I was surprised to see Jotham look at it with scorn. By the time we arrived, the women had prepared the evening meal, a kind of stew, well flavored with onion and garlic, and it was set out in a great steaming dish. We had awakened Jabin, and he was gazing about him with a look of doubt and fear. I could not blame him, for all was dim and close and strange to him. There were no brightly ornamented walls or tiled floors, no mother and maidservants to pet and scold him and wash his feet after his journey, and the firelight flickering from the torches cast shadows on the faces of those in the tent, making them seem rough and grim. There were two women in the tent, Leah, and the head wife of Hushai, and Tamar, her daughter. They stayed in the shadows, not speaking, and waiting to serve the men and see them fed before they ate themselves. The little boy we had seen before, whose name was Aphiah, and who was the son of a second wife, was not so shy. He stood himself firmly before Jabin, gazing upon him boldly, and reaching out to touch his fine clothes. Just a minute. Excuse me. Jabin shrank away, looking fearful and displeased. I was surprised that Jotham put his hand on his shoulder, as if to protect him, instead of slapping him for his cowardice. There was little talk as we seated ourselves cross-legged around the common dish, except from Aphiah. "That boy is from Tyre, father," he said, "where the evil ones live." Jabin did not seem to resent this, but looked at Aphiah with puzzled eyes. The food was good, though more than once I burned my fingers pulling chunks of meat from the steaming pot. After we had finished, a skin of cool water was passed around, from which Jabin drank thirstily, though he had eaten little of the food. At last the men settled back satisfied. Hushai ben Aaron, the father, whose beard was gray, but whose eyes were dark and bold, turned his shrewd gaze upon Jotham. "Now we will talk," he said, "and you will tell us why you one of the tribe of Ephraim, come to us from the city of evil, clothed in their finery and in company with a stranger from the nations. I began to be more and more uneasy. These people felt no friendliness toward us. Jotham had already been driven out from among them, and they hated my people. They were not like any people I had ever known before, and I wondered fearfully what we could expect from them. The tribe of Ephraim drove me out, said Jotham, because my mother was a woman of Tyre, but my heart is with the tribes, and I wish to return if they will have me. And the child? They would have made him pass through the fire of Moloch, the destroyer. It was to have been today when the sun was high. He was my kinsman, and I have brought him away. There was a murmur of astonishment at this, and Hushai turned his stern eyes toward Jabin. Come here, child, he said. Jabin gave Jotham a frightened look. Jotham set him upon his feet and gave him a push toward Hushai, who took him by the shoulders and drew him closer. Weak and soft, like all the Canaanites, he said harshly. They have fattened him, haven't they, to make a fine feast for their evil god. Our God, whom is greater than all others, does not ask the lives of our children, only the blasphemers and those who set themselves against him. There are the seeds of evil in this child. And he looked so sternly at Jabin that the boy began to cry, though I could see he was trying not to. The same anger seized upon Jotham and me, and we half rose from our places. But before we could speak, the young girl Tamar had come out of the shadows for the first time and had taken Jabin away. He is only a little boy, she said sharply, and I was surprised at how strong and bold her voice was. He is tired and has done no harm. He should be put to bed. Hushai ben Aaron was suddenly no longer fierce and frightening. He looked guiltily at our strange guide, who was smiling a little. She is right, said the stranger. Let her put the child to bed. No, no, cried Jabin. I want to stay with Jotham and Uriah. Then you shall stay with them, said Tamar gently. Where will our guests sleep? She looked sternly at her father, who shrugged, looked defeated, and turned the problem over to his wife. There was to be no more talk like that, for which I was glad, though I was still not easy in my heart. A place was made for Jotham, Jabin, and myself in a corner of the men's quarters. The night air was cold, and we wrapped ourselves well in our outer garments. It was hard to sleep, for the smells of the cooking pot filled the tent, and the window blew, and there were strange noises outside. What is that? Cried Jabin at the sound of a long howl close by the tent. Only a jackal, said Jotham. His voice sounded strange, as though he were listening in surprise to these sounds that he had not heard since childhood, and trying to remember how it had been before he had become a lord of Tyre. Do you think, whispered Jabin, that Moloch would punish me for running away? Moloch has no power here, said Jotham in that same wondering voice. This seemed to comfort the child, and soon he was asleep. But I lay awake till I heard the feet of Hushai ben Aaron and the stranger returning to the main tent. This woman, Hushai was saying, will she come herself? She will come, said the stranger, and you will see. She has the powers of 1,000 armed men. Why, what woman, I thought to myself, and they are they talking of armed men? Why are they talking of armed men? But I was already half asleep. God be with you, Barak ben Abinoam, said Hushai, and with her and with all of us. So now I knew the stranger's name. Barak, I thought. That means lightning. but he is not like lightning. And I went to sleep to dream of Barak, riding in a chariot beside the mighty woman in gleaming armor, who had the strength of 1,000 men. That is the end of chapter 9, and I'm going to stop right there. Chapter 10 is called The Knife is Ready, and the first word is though. So I hope that you're enjoying the story, and we'll be back hopefully on Thursday. And God bless you. Have a good night, and we'll see you then. Thanks.